Welcome to How Does Your Garden Grow? I hope you enjoy this informative gardening program. We are at Weston Nurseries for their program Daylillies and Friends. Daylillies are a favorite in the garden, colorful, easy care, and they propagate like crazy. Today we will learn what plants pair best with daylilies and draw out the display even longer with Holliston's own Lee Thomas.
When they asked me to do a talk, I said as long as I can talk about something I really, really like. And I really, really like daylilies. And I know it's kind of a tough sell these days. I think a lot of people don't like daylilies as much as I do. And it started a long time ago because my husband and I were both junior high school science teachers. So our gardening, our view, our everything started in July. That's when the party began. That's when we were free. That's when we would actually be able to tend and look. So I wanted an explosion of color. I wanted as much color as I could possibly get. I like the hot colors. I like the oranges and the reds and the purples and any combination thereof. And then I started going to look for what was available. And there's a lot of plants in that category that do this in the annual world. But in the perennial world, if you think about it, there aren't that many plants that do a big July show reliably every year. So that's how the whole daylily thing started. And we had a wonderful old hybridizer who used to release her plants through Weston Nurseries. It was Mrs. Frame. And I don't know if anybody has ever heard of Mrs. Frame's cultivars, but she was one of the first people in the area to breed and select and introduce different colored daylilies to the world. Because remember, most of us would grow up with the orange, occasionally a yellow, but that was kind of it. They were imported to this country from Japan and from China. They took off like crazy. That's why the orange roadside daylily is pretty much everywhere in the country for two reasons. One, because it was the first one to come here, and settlers traveling from east to west took them with them, planted them. The orange ones that you probably have in your yard or someplace in your neighborhood, not only do they spread, but they have viable seeds. So they literally do seed themselves. So they have kind of become the common daylily in the world. They were also the basis of all the breeding of the daylilies that we sell. They're like the mother plants of most of them. Eventually, the yellows started coming over from China. Some of the species like citrina with the lemon lily and Hyperion became one of the first tall yellow daylilies that was available to the public. And it still is a really good, sweetly scented yellow daylily. But then the daylily thing just took off. If you've ever gone online and shopped daylilies, there's purples, there's oranges with purple eye-zone. They're like, it's a candy store out there. It's a bubblegum machine. So I was the person who actually had them had the company bring in the trophy takers, because the trophy takers is the first line of what you would call collector daylilies. One of the big hybridizers introduced his collection to a nursery to grow it. So it's a very limited access to them because only certain companies grow the trophy takers, but this currently is our biggest source of different kinds of colors. Why do I like them besides the color? I like the fact that you can get them tall, you can get them short, you can get them pretty much any combination of plants. I like that you can get them all the way through July, and now you have a lot that are repeat bloomers that will go sometimes into early October if you have enough light and you give them enough water. What kind of care do they need? I think they're probably one of the most carefree plants you'll ever have. You can completely ignore them and they'll live year after year after year. But if you really want daylilies to do well, they like two things. They like water and they like fertilizer. So if you really want a good show from your daylilies in the spring, you go through and you feed them. I put a couple of choices here. For a long time, I used plant tone as a general fertilizer for my whole property. If you have not used the Espoma line, they're great. They're organic. They become part of soil structure easily. They last for a long time in the soil. This yields a really good, well-balanced plant. The foliage is good, the good scapes. Then I thought, and I always treat the Espoma shelves like a spice rack, you know, a little something for everything. So I use flower tone. Flower tone is my go-to for any of my perennials or annuals that make a lot of flowers, because it causes a plant to reach its full potential for how many flowers it can make without making the plant overgrow. And that's my biggest complaint with the Miracle-Gro thing. A lot of people love Miracle-Gro. They'll just hook it up to their hose and go to town. It makes a really beautiful show, and you can get a lot out of your plants if you do that. The drawback is if you have a brand new plant that you've just planted and you give it too much Miracle-Gro, it'll make a beautiful plant and maybe make a lot of flowers, but it doesn't concentrate on making the roots that it needs to succeed and be back the next year. So I think that for people who like Miracle-Gro and the results you get, I don't say stay away from it. I just use it on your established plants because they have their root systems in place. They can deal with it. A bloom booster, whether it's Miracle-Gro or Schultz or any of those, is a fantastic product because it's designed with a formulation for plants to encourage them to make as many flowers as possible. I find that flower tone does the same thing. I've gotten so when I plant a new daylily, I plant them with flower tone. If I have a long blooming perennial, I plant them with flower tone because it has all the capabilities of biotone and plant tone. It just has an extra little formulation so that the plant, once it makes its roots, will go on and reach its full potential for how many flowering stems they make. Now, because I'll use the terminology, a flowering stem on a daylily is a scape. That's what they call them. So if you see on one of the cards or a description about makes multiple scapes or makes 50 scapes, that's how many flowering stems. And if you think about how many flowers are on each scape, that's a big show for a long period of time. Try to water them in the morning. Try not to water their flowers. I'm an evening waterer also. I just don't water the flowers. If you water the flowers at the wrong time of day, you'll blotch the flowers. We have an overhead watering system. It's one of the things that I don't like about our overhead watering system. It affects the flowers if they have opened before the water hits them. So try to keep so you just water the ground around it. I think one of the best things you can do for a daylily is when you go out, and it's kind of a labor of love. You don't have to do it, doesn't change anything, but the spent flowers, they're not particularly attractive. My husband and I, we just throw them down within the planting. But if you just take them off and clean it up periodically, it's just a much better presentation. Because as time goes by and you have more and more flowers, you can have more and more of this. So just if you haven't done it routinely, do so. I like to also take a stem off. If it's a long blooming plant and that particular stem is done, Stella d'Oro, do you all know Stella, the little gold one, which is pretty much everywhere? You notice I didn't bring that one in. To me, that just sells itself. I don't really have to even talk about it. It was the first of the ever bloomers. That's one of the reasons that Stella is so popular. It's been around the longest. It also still performs beautifully. It's short. It's about 18 inches. It flowers and flowers and flowers. I do think it takes about a 2-week hesitation near the end of July. It's kind of when it gets through that hot month and all the scapes that they've had or they're done with that. I think that's the perfect time of year to clean it up, get rid of the old scapes, feed it. I think an ever bloomer like Stella or an ever bloomer like Happy Returns, which is its cousins, all the same breeding program. Because they're ever bloomers, I think they get worn out by the time they get to the end of July, because you've been watering a lot by then. Give us some flower tone. Just feed it. Because then, okay, it'll kick it in. Obviously the light isn't as good, the conditions aren't as perfect, but because it has a genetic capability to go on and create more stems, help it out. Give it some fertilizer so that if the light stays with the plant, in other words, you know how yards are, shadows come and go. Not everybody, most of us live in Massachusetts or Rhode Island or Connecticut or New Hampshire, and we have way too much shade to do what we want to do. But as long as your light hangs in there, you'll have flowers from Stella and most everbloomers right through till early October. You don't take it personally. If all of a sudden, let's say August and September turn into very dim, kind of cool months, you might find your daylilies kind of go, that's it, I'm done. Because the conditions aren't going to be strong enough for them to actually get really vibrant and decide to go on and make a big job. But if you have a nice late summer, and if the sun stays with you, and if you keep them fed, you're likely to get some color, not that whole full burst of June color, but enough color to go through. And you'll also find on Stella, because it makes so many scapes, the old scapes will get brown. So just aesthetically clean that up too as time goes by. You'll know when it's done. And there's a certain learning curve to knowing when a stem is done and when it might just have a young bud that's still forming. But when those stems do get done, they turn brown. And you can get to the end of the season if you don't clean them up, and you have as many greenscapes as you end up with spent scapes. So just clean them up a little bit. The other thing I like to do, because I think one of the biggest complaints with daylilies is what? Anybody have a complaint they want to vocalize about daylilies? No? They have a lot of leaves. There's a lot of leaves. So after bloom time, I tend to cut them off. I just cut them off. Sometimes they can look tired at the end of the season. I have a lot of daylilies in my collection that are not ever bloomers because I've been collecting for so many years. They're beautiful. They're purple. They're orange. They're red. They're red with a yellow eye zone. They're orange with a purple eye zone. I've been collecting online for a long time too, because it was my personal candy. That was my candy. But when they're done, and they start to look a little trashy. So I will simply cut them off and cut them off. And eventually, I have cut off that garden and that garden and this garden and this garden. But what will happen is they refresh themselves. They put on new growth, and then they go into the fall looking crisper and cleaner. And if they have the capability to go on and make flowers, they'll go on and do so. But then they look good doing it. They don't look quite so tragic as they did before. So, yes?
You say cut them off. How much do you leave?
Well, you know, when you look at a plant and you've got the fan, in each of these sections you can call a fan because they're very fan-shaped. You see where they split, they divide. If you cut it right above that split, right above the V, because that's where the new growth happens, is right between those two leaves. So if you cut it right about there, then the new growth just comes right up. You'll see the growth within a week, usually. You start watering it again, it refreshes itself, it looks good. And I think two things happen when you do that. The plant actually increases beneath the ground. It starts to get more of a body. It starts to put on more growth for next year, and it looks good. So you actually help the plant get bigger for the next year and make your garden look better. You just don't have that tragedy.
Do you fertilize at the same time then?
I only would fertilize something like Stella.
Just the rebloomers?
Yeah, just the rebloomers, because it wouldn't do you any good to fertilize the ones that are just have a certain season, then they're done. It wouldn't hurt them. It wouldn't hurt them. I think it kind of depends on the season, too. I feed them in the springtime because, number one, they're just starting to grow. It's been a wet winter, a wet spring. They're washed out. I think we all plant our daylilies well. I hope so. Use a lot of really wonderful compost when you plant. Assume if you lived in any of the aforementioned states, you don't have soil unless you make it. So you really want to spoil them, because if you've ever dug a mature clump of daylilies, it's a huge root system. Now, dividing them. It's really hard to divide a beautiful clump. I have some gorgeous clumps that I've never divided over 20 years because they still look good. And I don't want to start all over again. I mean, they're like enormous clumps, and I might have 100 scapes on them, so I'm not doing that. But if you do want to move it around, if you do want to do something with it, the best time to divide is the fall, because they're going into dormancy usually. Or if they do have some color, it's not much. You're going to cut them off anyway. So if you're going to dig and divide them, you cut them off right above the fan, right where it splits. Just not super low. I don't think you could hurt them. Honestly, it's really hard to hurt a daylily because they just have those succulent roots. But some people will take the shovel and just go right through the clump. I just can't do that. That's just too much brutality for me. I like to lift the whole thing up. I get a spading fork, I loosen, I loosen, I loosen, I loosen. I go all the way around the clump and loosen until the whole thing pops out. And it's good to see what's going on there. Sometimes you might find that the soil has gotten so used up in that area that you've got pill bugs and millipedes and things have moved into your root system. So that means you're really going to have to refresh your soil, get that cleaned up. That's just a response to having old things, old vegetation in there. So this is your opportunity to divide and replant everybody and give them a whole nother lease on life. I think periodically it's just a good thing to do to help your plants out. At that point, look at I think that any plant that's at least 3 fans is a good next plant. I think that's how I would do it. If you go to a daylily farm, how many of you have ever gone to a daylily farm? What do you buy? 1 fan, right? Right. It's a lesson in love and patience. Mail order still, all kinds of sites online, all kinds of daylily breeders, especially in the mid-Atlantic and down south, because they have a longer season. The Florida people can do successions of crops because they don't have to put up with winter. I don't necessarily think that mail ordering a daylily from Florida is a really good idea myself. I always stopped at the Carolinas, and I've had good luck with them too. So, but if you can get them locally, then you get them locally. Now, companions. I think one of the biggest complaints I've heard, especially from men, sorry, I know that's sexist, but is there's just so much leaf. And there's so much leaf to a daylily. And my daylily beds are really leafy in the springtime. So I compensate for that by, in the springtime, I have bulbs in mine. I have daffodils, I have tulips, I have things that hold the space while the daylilies are coming up. Because the daylilies will come up, they hide the foliage. I don't even have to worry about braiding or doing any of those things you have to do to make all that spent foliage on your bulbs look better, so I don't do that. I think that June has always been one of the times where a daylily garden gets rather vacant looking. There's very little going in there. I compensated by putting in tall lilies. I have liliums, the kind that have the straight stems with the leaves on the stalks. Again, all colors, and I'm bubblegum colors. I like all the hot colors. So I have now, within my daylilies, I have lilies just getting ready to pop. And for most of my daylilies, because I think this is a very delayed season, I don't know if any of you have scapes on your daylilies yet. Not too many. Because it was such a cold, wet spring, I thought the plants will be huge, but the show will be late. And I think that's what we're getting. The plants are gorgeous and lush and wonderful. So they'll be able to hold beautifully into the summer. And they have a lot of scapes, but it's really not going to start until we get into July. I think it's going to be a huge July. So I have the lilies now that kind of carry the show and will for the next month. That's wonderful. And then I gradually reduce them. I gradually take their stems down. Because by the time they get done, then the daylilies begin to show. Behind them, I have some tall things because I like color. I have red bee balm behind everybody. And I was going to show you the white snake root, the white semiciffugia I have. It's hard to talk about it without having a picture. This is the dark leaf semiciffugia. It's a lacy foliage. They get to be about 6 or 7 feet tall with their flowers. They are the background of this whole daylily garden. So that it's just hot, 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 hot colors, and then the background is white semiciffugia and red bee balm. So it looks like the 4th of July when it gets going. My July is amazing in this garden.
The white, what was the name of the white one?
The semiciffugia? Yeah, let me write that down for you. Yeah, and no, we did not get it in this week. I was really sad about that. I think you can use the difference between the dark leaf semiciffugias and the green one is the green one blooms in July, and this one blooms at the end of summer. So in my case, I use the July thing. And the one I use is the straight racemosa. And I hope to get them. It's one of those plants that if you can get it established, you'll have it forever. They just get bigger and better and more wonderful and make more flowers and sturdier and all that. Deer don't eat them either. That's always nice. Before we get into more companions, let's talk about the deer. Yeah. So, we all know how deer feel about hostas, right? Guess what their summer candy is? Daylily buds. They love daylily buds. Yeah. So I hadn't seen the deer in a long time. I live in Holliston. I live in the woods. There's a herd of 9 that thinks my house is their supermarket. They just think everything I do for them is wonderful. What have you brought us today? So I hadn't seen the deer in a long time last summer, and I just went off. I think we just went off to the beach for the day. Came back every single daylily bud in every single garden, just eaten every single one. I was crushed. I was crushed. I had the most sad July because I didn't have my color. I didn't have my explosion. This year, I have done everything. I have stunk up the neighborhood. Nobody else in the neighborhood does what I do, so I understand why they come over. So I have a hose-in repels all this year. I'm not messing around. I don't care what I smell like. So I'm just exploding this on every single garden because the scapes are coming up, the buds are forming. I'm using repels all. Yes, and I should apologize to the entire neighborhood, but I'm not. I wish they'd all plant everything too, so they'd go there too, but they don't. So, I think it would keep, no. But I would do all my spraying in the evening. Any spraying, by the way, that's a great question. Any spraying you're going to do for anything, whether it's a repellent or an insect deterrent, do your spraying in the evening when all the beneficial insects have gone home. And that also gives it a chance to dry overnight so that by the time you come out the next morning, everything's dry, life begins again. So I think it's an evening thing. Yeah. So that's when I do that. I also invested this year. I'm branching out. I went to Gardener Supply, and they have, anybody here use Gardener Supply? It's good. It's good. You can get things you can't get in an ordinary garden center. It's nice. When you simply can't find that apparatus or that support or whatever you want, yeah. So Gardener Supply this year is selling a repellent soap. Not that it's a new thing, but theirs says they, quote, guarantee it for a year. Mm-hmm. So I'm I'm trying that. And they smell rather like key lime pie. They're very limey. And they're just these little bars of soap in a mesh bag. And you're supposed to put them, it's funny, I looked at the instructions, and they'll say, for trees and shrubs, every 6 feet. And you're supposed to put them right about at bud level. Okay. And then they'll go for perennials and flowers every 6 feet. And then they'll go daylilies every 4 feet. They have their own category, daylilies. Okay, so they do know. So I end up investing in another 6 bars. So we're going to step up our density of soap. So I have them strategically placed right now against all of the daylilies that are in full scape, because now I have some early ones that are really loaded. And I didn't think the deer were here, but I went up to the compost pile, which is in the edge of the woods on the inside. And I do what I always do. I look up to see what the woods, make sure they're not there. And we hadn't seen any sign of them for almost 2 months. And I go screaming back down the house, they're here, they're here, they're here. Because there were 3 of them. It's a herd of 9 that haunted us all winter and ate everything, as you know. So this coming fall, I'm going to spray everything with this hose-in sprayer and try to save my hollies and my rhodies and all that. So as for companion plants, I like annuals too with my daylilies. I really do. Number 1, because of the colors. Number 2, because of the hummingbirds. Because the other thing that I like to encourage into my yard is hummingbirds. So I figured if I can do both, like I have a pool of my favorite daylilies right off the back porch, which happens to be one of the best places in my husband's vegetable garden. So to compensate for the fact that he's lost this fantastic piece of real estate that could be amazing tomatoes, I have a lot of hummingbird plants around my daylilies. So he's forgiven me over the years because we have a lot of hummingbirds right there. So I use the cigar plant. If you've never done cigar plant, it's a slam dunk when it comes to hummingbirds. We watch the hummingbirds every evening, and their first stop is always cigar plant. So I have a pot of it in the garden. I have it around my plants. I have it on the dining room table. I have it everywhere in my yard, so everywhere they go.
What's it called again?
Cigar plant.
Cigar.
Cigar. See, it looks like a cigar. Yeah. It's a kufia, but there's other kufias, but this particular cigar plant seems to be their absolute favorite. The other plant that I have, and I have this one kind of intermittently all over my daylily garden, is Salvia black and blue. Now, they will not show themselves this time of year because I put mine in early on when I could first get them. And Salvia black and blue will get to be almost 3 feet tall as time goes by, make huge flowers, another real hummingbird plant. And both the cigar plant and the Salvia black and blue will bloom right through till the first freeze. So it's a real consistency in the hummingbird's life. And when you have these rising above and with daylilies, it's really beautiful. They're rich and they're dark. And in my daylily gardens now, I have rich, dark, purple-blue flowers and orange cigar plant tucked around the edges that have been blooming for weeks because they've been there for weeks. So it's not a dead show. I also have bright yellow annuals growing at the base of my plants. I'll show you some of the things I have that I can do. And my colors are hot colors, so you can do whatever you like. So a lot of people have like pastels, and I actually do have one white daylily. I do. I love Santa Vitalia, which is an annual, which we didn't have any more of. And this is a Biden's, but I use this one also. But Santa Vitalia is, anybody know Santa Vitalia? I know, it's one of those things. I think most of us have annuals and we don't pay attention to the names. But I would always recommend everybody, if you have a series of plants that you've put in that you're unfamiliar with, save the tags. Because at the end of the season, you go, wow, I really like that plant. What was that? And I simply have a drawer in my garage for my tags. And it's kind of fun in the winter to revisit, you know, what I use, what I like, just kind of remind myself, yeah, I really did like that. Where'd I get that? Let's get that again. But these kinds of annuals, they're low. They're reliable for what they do. They're not going to overgrow and put on too much height. They're just going to spread out a little bit. And I kind of tuck them in the base of the front. Right now I have Santa Vitalia because it's a really bright yellow with a really dark, dark leaf. And I think that daylily foliage is that kind of medium green. No great shakes, really. So if you can put a plant that has either a bright flower at the front of it or a bright flower with a darker green leaf, it's a wonderful thing. The other thing I like to use a lot in one of my other daylily beds that's up near the woods is I use grasses. This is liriope, good old variegated lily turf. It just looks kind of perky. I tuck it in right between two daylilies. It's got this little perky, variegated explosion. At the end of the season, it has nice blue flowers, coincidentally. But I just think it kind of brightens up what would be kind of a dark edge. I didn't want annuals there, but I have this. I also use Hackanachoa, and these are young, so they're not really going to show themselves particularly. But a Hackanachoa, this is a Japanese forest grass. When they're mature, they just make this beautiful waterfall forward. So you can really, and one of my daylily plantings is on a slope. So this, on the edge of this slope, as you go around the daylilies, is really, really spectacular. So I highly recommend that too. Some people like to use the variegated plants. This is the variegated euchera. This one happens to have really great pink flowers when it has flowers. So there's really no rules on what you put with them. It's just please yourself. Give yourself something interesting. If you look at your daylily planting and you think, it's just kind of boring, then just go looking for something to perk it up. I almost brought up one of those little dwarf hydrangeas as being rather attractive. Nancy, what is that tiny little hydrangea that we have down there? Is it one of the city lines?
Oh, the city line?
Yeah, is it?
Tiny tough stuff?
Yeah, tiny tough stuff, yeah. Yeah, something like that too. That's really kind of calling my name because they do have a really long bloom time. I'm not sure how I feel about the sticks before. But I think that it'd be worth it having it just because I like the round form, I like the shape of the flower, I like the colors. I think this just gives me something else to look at that isn't a daylily frond. I've seen people do angelonia. I've seen a lot of people do cleome. I think the only drawback about cleome is that it tends to seed itself a little bit. If that doesn't bother you, then go for it. I think I've also seen, and I really love this one. We went to the Botanic Garden in Maine, the Maine Maritime Botanic Garden up in Boothbay. I had customers say, you gotta go, you gotta go, you gotta go. So my husband and I went last year. It was amazing. It was amazing. We were there at the end of the summer, and it was glorious. And there were so many bees and butterflies on verbena, on salvia, on calendula, straw flowers. It was just kind of crazy how many insects they had still. So my husband said, we got to put this in, because they had tucked it in with daylilies. They tucked it in everywhere. And what I like about it, it's a little sense of whimsy peeking up through the blades of daylily foliage, because why not? Why not have something that's going to kind of, and they can seed themselves. What I found that I think daylilies become so congested as time goes by that it's really hard for seedlings to get a foothold within them. I think the root systems are too dense. So I'm not going to worry about that, and honestly, I don't think I would worry about that. If it shows up, great, whatever. So this is Verbena bonariensis. This is definitely worth putting in just as a little, and they bloom all summer. So, and they're very tough plants. Behind, For texture, behind my daylilies, I tend to do Amsonia. This is Amsonia hubrichtii. If you've been out to the hosta tent behind the perennial area, there's a really big one growing in the gravel there that's been there for a long time. It's a great selling tool because people can see what it does. But what I like about them is that they do have wonderful blue flowers in May, but it's the texture. It's just that wonderful, mobile, lacy texture behind the daylily foliage that kind of just softens the whole look. I like to do anything that just softens the whole look. Because once the flowers happen, nobody sees anything except the flowers. But in the beginning and the end, it's nice to have things that kind of come and go and soften it. This plant, if you always want to see a mature one, we have one out there. It usually gets to be about maybe 30 inches tall, about equally wide, maybe a little wider as time goes by. I found it actually rose to the occasion because for us it's about 30. Where I have it, it had to rise above the daylilies to be seen. So it's easily 40 inches. Just the tips of it right back there, just looking really cute and sweet. So it will adapt if it has to. It will rise to the occasion. All right, what else? Some of these are just choices I've seen that people put with their daylilies because there's really no rules about what you put with them. I just think that if you know you're going to do a brand new planting, give yourself some room to put your additions. If you're working within an existing bed, it's difficult because you know what the root systems become. So you get to the point where you really can't insert too much between a mature bed because it's just too hard. It's too hard in there. The root systems have more or less met. And I will say that I have some of my plantings really tight together, but I really do spoil them rotten, so they're all really happy. So if you know you're going to do a mixed garden, give yourself some space. I think that if you can give yourself 30 inches between daylilies, that's really good for the future. Anything less is way too close because they just grow so well. All right, thanks for coming, y'all.